October 25th, 1944. The sun had barely crept over the horizon off the coast of Samar Island in the Philippines when lookouts aboard the escort carrier White Plains spotted something that made their blood run cold. On the northwestern horizon, distinctive pagoda-shaped masts were emerging from the morning haze. Japanese battleships. Not just any battleships, but the entire might of the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force, bearing down on them at full speed. And at the head of that formation, like a steel leviathan risen from the depths, sailed the Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever constructed by human hands. The American sailors knew they were looking at their own deaths. What they didn't know was that in the next few hours, they would write one of the most extraordinary chapters in naval history. A chapter where 3 small destroyers, led by a half-Cherokee commander from Oklahoma, would charge headlong into a force so overwhelming that survival seemed mathematically impossible. This is the story of the Battle off Samar, where David faced Goliath on the high seas, and somehow, against every conceivable odd, David won. Let me take you back to understand just how desperate this moment was. Task Unit 77.4.3, call sign Taffy 3, was not a battle fleet. These were not the mighty fast battleships and fleet carriers that dominated the Pacific War. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers, affectionately known as baby flat tops or jeep carriers. These were small, slow vessels built on merchant ship hulls, designed to provide air support for amphibious landings and hunt submarines. Their top speed was 18 knots. Think about that. 18 knots. The Japanese cruisers racing toward them could make 30 knots. The carriers might as well have been standing still. Protecting these 6 vulnerable carriers were 7 ships. 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, the Johnston, the Hull, and the Heermann, and 4 destroyer escorts, the Samuel B. Roberts, the Dennis, the John C. Butler, and the Raymond. These were tin cans, as destroyer sailors called their ships. The destroyers displaced about 2,100 tons. The destroyer escorts were even smaller, around 1,200 tons. Their main armament consisted of 5-inch guns, weapons designed to shoot down aircraft or fight other destroyers, not to engage battleships. Now let me tell you what was coming at them. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force had passed through the San Bernardino Strait during the night, completely undetected. His force consisted of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. This was 23 warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the cream of what remained of their fleet. And leading this armada was the Yamato, flagship of the combined fleet. The Yamato was not just big. She was beyond comprehension. 72,800 tons of displacement. Her main battery consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. Each shell from these guns weighed over 3,200 pounds. That's more than 1.5 tons of armor-piercing steel and explosive, traveling at 1,500 miles per hour. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick. To put this in perspective, the 5-inch guns on the American destroyers fired shells that weighed 54 pounds. Against Yamato's armor, these shells were like throwing pebbles at a tank. The disparity in firepower was almost obscene. Yamato alone displaced more tonnage than all 13 American ships combined. Her 9 main guns could throw more weight of metal in a single broadside than every gun on every American ship firing simultaneously. And she wasn't alone. With her came the battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, each a formidable capital ship in its own right, along with heavy cruisers mounting 8-inch and 6-inch guns. When Admiral Clifton Sprague, commander of Taffy 3, received the report that an enemy fleet had been sighted, his first thought was that it must be a mistake. It had to be friendly ships. But then the shells started falling. Massive geysers of water, colored pink, green, yellow, and red from the dye markers Japanese ships used to spot their fall of shot, began erupting around the American carriers. Each splash towered hundreds of feet into the air. Sprague realized with horror that the reports were true. The Japanese had somehow gotten behind them, and his little escort carrier group was all that stood between Kurita's battleships and the invasion beaches of Leyte Gulf, where over 100,000 American soldiers and Marines were landing, completely vulnerable. Sprague did the only thing he could. He ordered his carriers to turn east and run at maximum speed. He ordered them to make smoke. And then he did something that must have torn at his heart. He ordered his screening ships, those 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts, to attack, to charge directly into the teeth of the most powerful surface fleet Japan had left. It was a suicide mission, and everyone knew it. Aboard the destroyer Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans didn't wait for the order. He had already made his decision. Evans was 36 years old, a stocky, barrel-chested man with straight black hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life at sea. He was half Cherokee and a quarter Creek, born in Pawnee, Oklahoma in 1908. His upbringing had been hard. His white grandfather had married a Creek woman to gain control of her land allotment, then promptly divorced her and disowned their son, Evans' father. Ernest Evans grew up poor in a state where prejudice against Native Americans was commonplace. But he had steel in his spine. He graduated from an almost entirely white high school in Muskogee. He enlisted in the Navy in 1926, served as an enlisted man, and then, without any political connections, received an appointment to the United States Naval Academy. Think about what that meant. A poor Cherokee kid from Oklahoma, in an era when Native Americans faced systematic discrimination, earning his way into Annapolis through sheer merit and determination. He graduated in 1931 and spent the next 12 years rising through the ranks. When the Johnston was commissioned on October 27, 1943, exactly 1 year and 2 days before the battle off Samar, Evans addressed his crew with words that would become legendary. "This is going to be a fighting ship," he told them. "I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." His crew called him the chief, though never to his face. They knew he was proud of his Native American heritage. They also knew he was a warrior who would never ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Evans had another reason for his fierce determination. Earlier in the war, while serving as executive officer aboard the destroyer Alden in the Java Sea, he had been forced to retreat from a superior Japanese force. It was the right tactical decision, but it had gnawed at him. He had vowed he would never run from the enemy again. Now, on the morning of October 25, 1944, he had his chance to keep that vow. At 6:58 a.m., just 8 minutes after the Japanese were sighted, Evans ordered the Johnston to flank speed and turn directly toward the enemy fleet. He didn't wait for orders from Admiral Sprague. He saw what needed to be done, and he did it. The Johnston's crew went to battle stations, and the ship began laying smoke to screen the carriers. But Evans wasn't content with defense. He was going on the attack. The Johnston charged alone across 25,000 yards of open ocean, directly at the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano and the battleship Yamato. Imagine being on that bridge. You're sailing a 2,000-ton destroyer at 35 knots, straight at ships that outweigh you by factors of 15 or 20. Shells are already falling around you, some so close that the towering columns of water drench your deck. Your 5-inch guns are firing as fast as the crews can load them, but you know those shells are bouncing off enemy armor like raindrops off a roof. And still, you keep going because your commander has decided that if you're going to die, you're going to make it count. At 10,000 yards, close enough that the Japanese gunners couldn't possibly miss, Evans ordered all 10 of the Johnston's torpedoes launched at the Kumano. The Mark 15 torpedoes left their tubes in 2 spreads, their wakes drawing white lines across the blue Pacific water. And then Evans ordered hard rudder, throwing the Johnston into a violent turn to avoid the incoming fire. It was too late. The Japanese found their range. The first salvo that hit the Johnston came from 14-inch guns on one of the battleships. The shells smashed into the destroyer's superstructure. The after-fire room was demolished. The after-engine room flooded. One engine stopped completely, cutting the Johnston's speed in half. The gyro compass was destroyed. The steering control was knocked out. The radio was shattered. 3 of the 5-inch gun mounts were disabled. Over 40 men were killed or wounded in that first devastating hit. Commander Evans himself was struck by shrapnel that tore into his face and body, mangling 2 of his fingers. Blood poured down his face, but he refused medical attention. There was no time. The battle had barely begun. But the Johnston's torpedoes found their mark. At least one, possibly two, slammed into the Kumano's bow, blowing it completely off. The heavy cruiser slewed sideways, out of control, and began to fall out of formation. Her sister ship Suzuya had to break off to escort the crippled vessel. Two Japanese heavy cruisers, knocked out of the fight by one destroyer that was supposed to have been blown out of the water in the first salvo. The psychological impact on the Japanese commanders was enormous. What kind of destroyers were these Americans sending against them? With one engine gone and steering damaged, the Johnston's crew had to manually control the rudder. Evans moved his command to the fantail, the rear of the ship, because the bridge was wrecked and filled with the dead and dying. He stood there, bleeding from his wounds, shouting steering orders down through an open hatch to sailors who were turning the rudder by hand. The ship was burning in multiple places. Smoke poured from her shattered superstructure, but her guns kept firing. The Hull and the Heermann, the other two destroyers, had followed the Johnston's lead. Behind them came the Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort that would fight so ferociously she'd be nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. These four ships, none larger than 2,100 tons, charged into a fleet that included 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers. It was insane. It was impossible. It was magnificent. Admiral Kurita, watching from the bridge of the Yamato, was confused. His intelligence had told him that this area was defended only by light forces. Yet here were ships attacking him with a ferocity and determination that suggested a much larger force. The American destroyers were throwing up so much smoke that visibility was reduced to near zero in places. Aircraft from the escort carriers were making attack runs, dropping bombs and torpedoes, some even making dry runs when they ran out of ordnance, anything to keep the Japanese gunners off balance. The melee was unlike anything Kurita had experienced. Ships were appearing and disappearing in the smoke. Torpedoes were crisscrossing the water. The Americans weren't running. They were fighting. For over an hour, the Johnston continued to engage. With only one working engine and a top speed now of 17 knots, she maneuvered constantly, using smoke and rain squalls for cover. Her remaining guns fired at anything Japanese that came into range. At one point, she engaged the heavy cruiser Chikuma, pumping dozens of 5-inch shells into the enemy vessel. Chikuma was already under attack by aircraft from the carriers, and the combined assault set her ablaze and eventually led to her sinking. The Johnston also fired on the battleship Congo, forcing the massive ship to turn away to avoid a perceived torpedo attack. Think about this for a moment. The Johnston, a destroyer that had already been crippled, that was down to one engine, that had no torpedoes left, that had half her guns knocked out, was making a battleship maneuver defensively. The sheer audacity of it is almost beyond belief. But that was Ernest Evans. That was the spirit he had instilled in his crew. They would fight until they couldn't fight anymore, and then they would fight some more. But courage, no matter how great, cannot overcome physics forever. The Japanese had the Johnston bracketed now. She was too slow to dodge effectively. Too many guns were targeting her. At 9:30 in the morning, 2.5 hours after the battle began, the concentrated fire of multiple Japanese cruisers and destroyers finally overwhelmed the gallant ship. Shells rained down on her from every direction. An 18-inch shell from the Yamato struck the Johnston amidships, tearing away the entire rear third of the ship. That single shell weighed more than the Johnston's entire remaining crew. The explosion was cataclysmic. The ship was done. Water was pouring into the hull. Fires raged out of control. Most of the crew were dead or wounded. Commander Evans, still standing on what remained of the fantail, bleeding from multiple wounds, gave the order to abandon ship. Men began jumping into the oil-slicked water. Those who could still move helped the wounded over the side. There were not enough life rafts. Many men had to tread water, knowing that sharks and exposure would claim many of them even if they survived the battle. At 10:10 a.m., the Johnston rolled to port and began her final dive. As she went down, something extraordinary happened. The Japanese destroyer Yukike's, which had been firing at the Johnston moments before, came to a stop nearby. Her crew lined the rails, and as the American destroyer slipped beneath the waves, the Japanese sailors came to attention and saluted. It was a warrior's tribute to a worthy foe. Even the enemy recognized the incredible courage they had just witnessed. Commander Ernest Evans was last seen in the water, seriously wounded but alive. Some survivors reported seeing him get into a damaged lifeboat. The commander of the UKKs later claimed he saw Evans returning the salute from that lifeboat as the Japanese destroyer sailed past. But Evans was never recovered. Of the Johnston's crew of 327 men, only 141 survived. 186 died, including their commander. Many, including Evans, were alive in the water after the ship sank but were never seen again. Sharks, exposure, and exhaustion claimed them over the next 50 hours before rescue ships could reach the survivors. But what did the Johnston and her sisters accomplish with their sacrifice? Everything. The torpedo attacks by the destroyers had crippled or sunk 3 Japanese heavy cruisers. The Kumano, her bow blown off by the Johnston's torpedoes, would limp away only to be finished off by American aircraft and submarines a month later. The Chikuma, hammered by the Johnston's guns and carrier aircraft, sank during the battle. The Cherokee was also mortally damaged and had to be scuttled. The aggressive attacks forced the Japanese formation to break up. Ships turned to avoid torpedo spreads. The American smoke screens created confusion. Aircraft from the carriers, though armed primarily with anti-submarine weapons, made continuous attacks that harassed and distracted the Japanese gunners. Admiral Kurita, watching this chaos unfold, became convinced he was facing a major American fleet rather than a handful of escort carriers and destroyers. The ferocity of the defense suggested fleet carriers with their large air wings. The torpedo attacks were executed with a precision and aggression that suggested experienced destroyer squadrons supporting capital ships. Kurita's intelligence had been wrong before. Perhaps it was wrong again. His ships had taken damage. He was low on fuel. And most critically, he had lost the element of surprise. The Americans knew he was there now. More ships would be coming. At 9:35, just as the Johnston was receiving her death blows, Kurita made his decision. He ordered his fleet to break off the attack and withdraw. The invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf, with their 100,000 vulnerable soldiers and the hundreds of transports and supply ships, would remain unmolested. The last major Japanese naval offensive of the war had been turned back, not by battleships or fleet carriers, but by 6 escort carriers and 7 tin cans, of which 4 would never return home. The cost had been terrible. Along with the Johnston, the destroyer Hull, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts were sunk. The escort carrier Gambier Bay, hit repeatedly by Japanese shells, became the only American aircraft carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the entire war. Over 1,000 American sailors died in the battle off Samar, but they had saved thousands more. If Kurita's fleet had reached the landing beaches, the massacre would have been unimaginable. The entire Leyte operation, perhaps even the liberation of the Philippines, could have been jeopardized. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, wrote afterward that the success of Taffy 3 was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. But it wasn't divine intervention. It was courage. It was training. It was sailors who knew they were going to die and went ahead and did their duty anyway. And leading them was a Cherokee commander from Oklahoma who had promised his crew he would go in harm's way, and kept that promise to the very end. Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the first Native American in the United States Navy to receive the nation's highest military decoration. He was one of only 2 destroyer commanders in World War II to be so honored. The citation for his medal reads in part, "By his indomitable courage and brilliant professional skill, he aided materially in turning back the enemy during a critical phase of the action. His valiant fighting spirit throughout this historic battle will endure as an inspiration to all who served with him." The Johnston herself was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, along with the rest of Taffy 3. She received 6 battle stars for her service in World War II. But perhaps the greatest tribute came from the sailors who served with Evans. One of them said, "The skipper was a fighting man from the soles of his broad feet to the ends of his straight black hair. He was an Oklahoman and proud of the Indian blood he had in him. We called him the Chief, though not to his face. The Johnston was a fighting ship, but he was the heart and soul of her. The wreck of the Johnston remained lost for 76 years. The battle had taken place over the Philippine Trench, one of the deepest parts of the world's oceans. In October 2019, explorer Victor Vescovo located the wreck lying in 21,000 feet of water, nearly 4 miles down. It took until March 2021 to positively identify the wreck as the Johnston. She was the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed at the time, though that record would be broken the following year when the Samuel B. Roberts was found even deeper. Vescovo's submersible filmed the ghostly remains of the destroyer. The damage she sustained in battle is still visible. The rear third of the ship is missing, torn away by that 18-inch shell from the Yamato. The bridge is shattered. The hull is riddled with holes from countless hits. But her 5-inch guns are still trained to starboard, the direction her crew was firing when she went down. Her torpedo racks are empty, every weapon expended. She is a tomb now, protected by law from looters and salvagers, a memorial to the 186 men who died with her. What can we learn from the battle off Samar and the charge of the Johnston? There are tactical lessons, certainly. The value of smoke screens, the effectiveness of aggressive torpedo attacks, the importance of aircraft even when they're not optimally armed for the mission. Naval historians still study the battle for its demonstration of how smaller ships can disrupt a larger force through aggressive action. But I think the real lesson goes deeper. It's about what human beings are capable of when they're pushed to the absolute limit. Those men on the Johnston, on the Hull, on the Heermann, on the Samuel B. Roberts, on all the ships of Taffy 3, knew the odds. They knew that mathematically, they had almost no chance of survival. The smart move, the logical move would have been to run, to scatter and hope some of them could escape while the Japanese were busy with the carriers. But they didn't run. They turned toward the enemy and attacked. They did this not because they were stupid or didn't understand the danger. They did it because they understood something more important than their personal survival. They understood duty. They understood that behind them were 100,000 soldiers and Marines on the beaches of Leyte, men who were counting on the Navy to protect them. They understood that if they ran, if they let the Japanese through, the war might be prolonged by months or years. Tens of thousands more might die, so they decided that their lives were a price worth paying. Ernest Evans embodied this spirit. He had come from nothing. He had faced prejudice and hardship his entire life. He could have been bitter. He could have done the minimum required and no more. Instead, he became one of the finest naval officers of his generation. When his moment came, when the test arrived that would define his entire life, he didn't hesitate. He turned his ship toward the enemy and attacked. He kept fighting even when his ship was crippled, even when he was wounded, even when any rational person would have known the cause was hopeless. There's a phrase that gets used a lot in military circles: death before dishonor. Sometimes it sounds like empty bravado, but Evans and his crew showed what it really means. They chose death over the dishonor of failing in their duty. They chose to go down fighting rather than live with the knowledge that they had run when others were counting on them. The battle off Samar has been called the Navy's finest hour, and I believe that's accurate. Not because the Navy won a great victory through superior force or technology, but because ordinary men, sailing in unimpressive ships, facing impossible odds, rose to a level of heroism that transcends ordinary human experience. They showed us what we can be at our best. They showed us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite fear. They showed us that duty can be stronger than the survival instinct. They showed us that 3 tiny destroyers can charge the world's largest battleship and win, not by sinking it, but by refusing to yield. Today, the names of the battle off Samar live on in the Navy. New ships have been named for the heroes of that day. The USS Evans, named for Ernest Evans. The USS Copeland, named for Robert W. Copeland, commander of the Samuel B. Roberts. The USS Hull, the USS Johnston, the USS Carr, all named for ships or men who fought in that desperate morning off Samar. Every officer who goes through the Surface Warfare Officer School at Newport, Rhode Island, trains on the Evans Full Mission Simulator, named in honor of the Cherokee destroyer commander from Oklahoma. But the best memorial isn't a ship or a building. It's the story itself, passed down from one generation of sailors to the next. It's the knowledge that when the moment came, when everything was on the line, American sailors didn't flinch. They didn't break. They stood fast and fought with a courage that awed even their enemies. When you hear about the Battle of Leyte Gulf, you usually hear about the big actions. The Battle of the Surigao Strait, where American battleships crossed the T and annihilated a Japanese force in the last battleship versus battleship action in history. The attacks on the Japanese carriers in the north that drew Halsey's fleet away. These were important actions, involving hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. But it was off Samar, in a battle that lasted less than 3 hours, that the real soul of the Navy was revealed. 3 tiny destroyers charged the world's largest battleship and won. Not because they had better weapons or more armor or superior numbers. They won because they had something the Japanese couldn't match. They had men like Ernest Evans, who would rather die than fail in their duty. They had crews who trusted their commanders enough to follow them into hell. They had a cause they believed in deeply enough to give everything for it. The Johnston lies now in eternal darkness, for miles beneath the Pacific waves. Her crew rests with her, honor dead who gave their lives in defense of their shipmates and their country. But their story lives on, a testament to courage, to sacrifice, to the indomitable spirit of men who refuse to accept defeat. When people ask what makes America special, what makes the American military different, I think about Taffy 3. I think about Ernest Evans standing on the fantail of his dying ship, wounded and bleeding, shouting steering orders to men turning the rudder by hand. I think about sailors who kept fighting even when their ship was coming apart around them. I think about the Japanese destroyer that stopped to salute as the Johnston went down, acknowledging a bravery that transcended nationality and war. That's the legacy of the battle off Samar. That's the story of 3 tiny destroyers that charged the world's largest battleship and won. Not by sinking it, but by refusing to be beaten. Not by superior force, but by superior will. They showed us that David can beat Goliath if David is brave enough to stand and fight. They showed us that the size of the fight in the dog matters more than the size of the dog in the fight. They showed us that ordinary men, in their finest hour, can achieve the extraordinary. So the next time you feel overwhelmed, the next time the odds seem impossible, the next time you're facing something that logic says you cannot overcome, remember the Johnston. Remember Ernest Evans. Remember those sailors who looked death in the face and charged anyway. Remember that courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. Remember that duty matters. Honor matters. Sacrifice matters. And remember that sometimes, just sometimes, 3 tiny destroyers can charge the world's largest battleship and win. That's the story of Samar. That's the legacy of the Johnston. That's the finest hour of the United States Navy. And that's a story worth remembering, worth honoring, and worth telling again and again, so that future generations will know what real courage looks like.